Okay, so I think my paper is going to be a little bit more reflective and a bit more informal than some of the ones we've heard today, but I hope it is still of interest. So I thought I'd start actually with a little bit of background about my involvement with the history of emotions and how I came to find myself working in this field. So if we go back, I started my PhD in 2011 at the University of Melbourne, and when I proposed the PhD, I really only had one aim in mind, which was to re-examine the role of the devil in early modern English witchcraft pamphlets. As many of you will know, the devil has been very unfairly left out of a lot of English witchcraft scholarship, which happily is changing. And so my aim was to try and redress this balance in part. Now, when I started my PhD, I wasn't really thinking about emotions at all, which looking back on it seems quite naive now. But 2011, the year I started, was also the year that the Australian Research Council of Excellence for the History of Emotions was started. So for those of you unaware, this was one of the largest grants that has ever gone to humanities in Australia before. It was a grant across 5 universities over 7 years of about $24 million, which is about £16 million. So everyone was a bit excited, really. Everyone decided that suddenly emotions were actually key to what they were doing, which is something we still hold on to until it ends next year. That will change. So my PhD supervisor, Charles Zeker, was one of the chief investigators of this project, and surprisingly, I became involved very quickly. This may seem just like blatant opportunism. However, I did find, the more I thought about it, that it really seemed very misguided to be trying to look at a phenomenon like witchcraft without looking at emotion. So what I'd like to do today is talk a bit about my understanding of the history of emotions, how I apply it to my own work, and what I think some of the next steps are for myself and also for the field in general. So a bit about my work. So my PhD is coming out as a book in about 3 months, and the PhD looked at all extant 17th century English witchcraft pamphlets, of which there were about 55. And I've expanded the book to cover the entire period of state-sanctioned witchcraft accusations in England, which is 1563 to 1735. And that leaves us with about 66 witchcraft pamphlets, depending on how you count them. Many of these have never been studied before. Now, my book makes 2 main arguments about these pamphlets. Firstly, that the centrality of the devil in these pamphlets challenges the long-held historiographical view that English witchcraft is predominantly malefic and not diabolical. And secondly, that these pamphlets position strong emotions such as hate, anger, envy, greed, vengeance, lust, and love as the primary motivators for witchcraft acts and accusations. Although there is much to be said about the supposed witchcraft victims accusing witches out of a myriad of their own emotions, my book focuses on the emotions of the witches primarily. So, how do we access the emotions of a long-dead witch who is nearly always illiterate and whose emotions were written down and mediated by pamphleteers, clerks, magistrates, and numerous other actors? Many of the early debates in the Australian Centre for Emotions revolved around, could we do this? Could we actually do emotions history? I always found this very frustrating, given that we were sitting in a room being paid to do it. So I felt that we really needed to get over that and actually think about how we could do it, not whether we could do it. So one thing I've noticed among some scholars, particularly since moving to an institution that is more sceptical of emotions history, is that people tend to put emotions history in a special category of unknowability, as if we can never really know what people were feeling or thinking, and it is dangerous and somehow irresponsible to try. Firstly, I think this argument can really be applied to any area of history. So it seems slightly irrelevant. Why do we feel comfortable talking about the motivations behind a political assassination, but not the emotions that may have motivated that same assassination? But also, and as I'm sure you all agree, or I hope you agree, emotions history is about far more than just trying to work out what a particular person was feeling at a particular time. Among other things, it is about understanding how men and women performed their emotions, what emotional behaviours were expected within certain groups, and how people who failed to conform to these standards of emotional behaviour were treated. And I think in witchcraft narratives, at least in English context, we can see accused witches as men and women who failed to conform to what was expected of them emotionally. Okay, so first some notes on pamphlets. Witchcraft pamphlets differ considerably from many other types of printed pamphlets in that they all concern real cases of witchcraft and quite often contain information that comes directly from a witch's examination and from witness statements. Numerous witchcraft historians have remarked on the importance of pamphlets for studying English witchcraft, commenting both on their accuracy compared to trial records and their greater level of detail. Pamphlets include a multiplicity of influences and are ultimately shaped by the pamphleteer's editorial decisions, which, for the most part, must have been based on what he believed would sell. But this is not to diminish the importance of a witch's influence. As Linda Roper has argued, even under duress, women were able to use their confessions for witchcraft as a form of diabolical theatre, a space where ordinary women were able to incorporate their own anxieties and fears, and I would argue anger and desire for revenge, into a diabolical narrative. Popular pamphlets should not be read as a representation of a learned system of belief forced onto a populace. Rather, they contain a melding of popular and learned belief and clearly highlight a witch's own experience and her emotions. So perhaps I should pause here and say something about how I first approached these pamphlets methodologically. So when I was reading through my pamphlets, I had a number of tables in Word, it was very high-tech, which I used to record key quotes and examples which I categorised under headings such as Devil's Mark, Catholic practices, sexual practices, and so on. And I also, of course, had several charts for emotion, which was basically a record of who was showing emotion, what the emotion was, and who it was directed at. The chart was divided into 5 categories: witches' emotions, victims' emotions, witnesses' emotions, authorities' emotions, and temperaments. Surprisingly and overwhelmingly, nearly all emotions mentioned in the text were used to describe how the witch felt and her motivations for performing witchcraft. Now, of course, we need to remember that this is not a straightforward case of seeing an emotion in print, such as the witch was enraged, and assuming that the witch is actually enraged. In this descriptor, though, we do possibly get a glimpse of the witch's emotion, depending on the context, which I'll give a couple of examples of later. But we also see what types of emotions were associated with witchcraft, and, in many cases, that exhibiting or losing control of certain emotions was to associate someone with witchcraft and the diabolical. I found that anger, hatred, and malice were the emotions most likely to be associated with witchcraft. As I worked on this table, it became clear that describing a witch's emotional state or emotional motivation was crucial to a witchcraft narrative, and that a witch's emotion was, in turn, the catalyst for giving in to the devil, or, in some rarer cases, actually letting the devil in. As such, as I continued to work on this table, I developed a new category: examples in which the devil was only able to access potential witches because of their emotions. It became clear to me that a primary concern of witchcraft pamphlets was to demonstrate how giving in to negative emotions, such as rage, anger, fear, and a desire for revenge, ended badly, often in the form of execution for witchcraft. Some examples. One case, which I think highlights how we can attempt to get the emotions of long-dead witches, is that of Mother Sutton, a widow of declining years who was accused of witchcraft in 1613. The pamphlet tells us that Mother Sutton was angry with Master Enger, a gentleman of worship. No explanation for this anger is given, but we are told that the same Mother Sutton killed all of Master Enger's horses. Gruesomely, we are told that some of the horses were strangled and some beat out their own brains. Mother Sutton also bewitched Master Enger's pigs so that some of them suddenly fell mad and violently tore out the guts and bowels of the other pigs. Here, the pamphleteer editorializes about Mother Sutton's malicious nature and desire for revenge, highlighting the types of emotions viewed as typical of witches. However, later in the narrative, we receive more of a glimpse into what Mother Sutton may have been motivated by. It is revealed that Master Enger has slapped her son, Henry, and sent him home crying. We are told that Mother Sutton vows to take revenge with the help of her diabolical spirits, even though, as the pamphleteer editorializes, Henry wasn't even hurt and really shouldn't have been crying. For many pamphleteers, witches were vengeful creatures who reacted unnecessarily violently against those who they perceived to have wronged them, not actually victims of an assault. We can be fairly confident, I think, that many accused witches did feel that they had been insulted or injured, and that they did feel the need to punish those who had wronged them. As such, after Henry has been hurt, Mother Sutton apparently uses her 2 devilish spirits, Dick and Jude, to strike and turn to torment the young son of Master Enger. Now, although to modern readers Mother Sutton's reliance on evil spirits is dubious, her anger and desire for revenge on behalf of her son, I think, rings true. We see a similar dynamic in a 1612 case when a gentlewoman, Mistress Belcher, slaps Joan, an accused witch, for supposedly unwomanly behaviour, and this slap is not denied. She definitely was slapped. Joan vows to take revenge on his humiliation, and once again the pamphleteer editorialises about her out-of-control emotions. Now, I mentioned earlier that in some pamphlets I found that the devil was able to access witches directly because of their emotions. In other words, men and women who were not witches at the time, or not believed to be witches at the time, gave in to overwhelming emotion and made a pact with the devil, thus becoming witches. So this works in two main ways. Firstly, in the vast majority of cases, witches were believed to join with the devil to fulfill an emotional desire, most often revenge, but also unrequited love or general malice. This desire prompted their demonic transformation. In some cases, though, the devil appears to a potential witch at the precise moment that he or she has lost emotional control. So take, for example, the case of the flower witches, accused in 1618 and immortalised in print in 1619. Margaret Flower, the mother, was well known for her laziness, her malice, and her association with base characters. Even more seriously, she was suspected of she's the daughter, working with her mother Joan Flower, a suspected witch, for unknown but undoubtedly evil purposes. Joan Flower, we are told, is a monstrous, malicious woman, full of oaths, curses, and imprecations irreligious, who had eyes which were fiery and hollow, speech fell and envious, and a demeanour strange and exotic, all of which gave great suspicion that she was a notorious witch who dealt with familiar spirits. And here we see that Joan's malice is part of the reason for her neighbours' suspicion. Unsurprisingly, Joan's neighbours claimed they were terrified of her, particularly by her curses and threatening of revenge. Margaret Flower's base lifestyle and the suspicion that she was a thief who was plotting unnamed evil with her mother, Joan Flower, led to her dismissal from the Earl's household where she worked. Now, Margaret's dismissal infuriated both herself and her mother. We are told that this dismissal turned her love and liking towards this honourable Earl and his family to hate and rancour. Joan is exceedingly angry on her daughter's behalf and grudged at it exceedingly, swearing in her heart to be revenged. In her anger over her daughter's mistreatment, Joan curses the Earl's family, and at this exact moment, the pamphlet tells us, the devil perceives the inficious disposition of this wretch, and that she and her daughters might easily be made instruments to enlarge his kingdom. The pamphleteer emphasises Joan's loss of control and her negative emotions and presents her malicious disposition as key to her fall into witchcraft. Without it, Joan would not have lost control of her emotions, cursed the Earl's family, and given in to hatred, and so attracted the devil's attention. So I'm conscious of time, and in the last few minutes I would like to summarise and perhaps hint at some of the next steps, both for myself and for emotions more broadly. One of the core ambitions of the Australian Centre for the History of Emotions is to understand how emotions create historical change, and also how they can actively be used by communities to resist change or new attempts to regulate emotion. And I think this is really key. If we can see emotion as a key historical actor, one that changes the ways in which we think about historical events and historical change, then I think this is really worthwhile and something we should really be working towards. In looking at all extant early modern English witchcraft pamphlets over an almost 200-year period, I found that amongst all the changes to witchcraft statutes, political bodies and religious dogma, there were two things that remained fundamentally unchanged: the belief that witches need to work with the devil in order to harm their neighbours, and the types of emotions that were associated with witchcraft narratives and how these emotions were described in print. Between 1563 and 1735, the emotional character of witchcraft accusations remained relatively unchanged, despite the huge social, cultural and political changes that characterised England during that period. By turning our attention to emotions, we can start to understand how witchcraft beliefs continued and still continue over such a long period. When we do this, we find that emotions were not secondary, but something that were fundamental in driving witchcraft beliefs, acts and accusations. And as I begin to work on my next project, I hope to explore this idea in relation to a whole host of supernatural phenomena, and I'm looking forward to hearing everyone's thoughts about how we can do this. Thank you.